you often get artistic types like Andre Gide, let's say, and left-wing intellectuals pushing for full sexual freedom. And some of that's high openness and some of that's low conscientiousness, that's for sure. But then there's a kickback that's really interesting to me, because it's the same radicals possessed by exactly the same set of ideas who make a very radical counterclaim. And the counterclaim is something like every form of sexual behavior must be celebrated and is nothing but a testament to the ever-blossoming range of human freedom. But every form of sexual interaction between particularly a young man and a young woman is so dangerous right to its core that there's nothing more important than full consent. And that consent has to be documented verbally and maybe even beyond verbally, formally, for even interactions that were once as casual, let's say, as dancing. And so at Princeton University, for example, there was a push to make men ensure that even when they're dancing with a girl who agreed to dance, that it was incumbent upon them multiple times during the dance to ask verbally to ensure that once established consent was still continuing. Now, if you weren't being cynical about that, you might say that's a stumbling attempt to approximating awake politeness, because if you have any sense, when you're dancing with someone, one of the things you actually want to know is, do they really want to be doing it? But it's very peculiar to me and illuminating that this insistence on negotiated contract for every step of a potentially sexual interaction is being insisted upon not by Christian apologists for traditional morality, but by the same radicals who are out there dancing three-quarters naked in the street in their dog costumes and insisting that every bit of sexual expression is to be lauded. So here's the rule, is that responsibility abdicated is vacuumed up by tyrants. And so if young men and young women aren't regulating their own sexual behavior, then tyrannical bureaucrats will definitely step in to have fun on that front. But you brought up 2 points that we could pursue, and one is an analysis of what actually constitutes consent. And then we could start with that. And then the other one was inhibition and oppression, let's say, of sexual desire. See, this is something that has to be handled conceptually very carefully. So there's different models of socialization that permeate let's say, the psychological community. And one of them is an ethos of something like inhibition and repression. And so the Freudians fall into that camp, that the superego inhibits the id and squashes it down, let's say, and that part of what makes you a social being is your ability to suppress and inhibit desires like aggression and sex. And I don't think that's true. I only think that's true when it's gone wrong. So here's an alternative viewpoint. This is the viewpoint of people like Jean Piaget, who's a great developmental psychologist. He thought of the developmental process as one of integration. Now, you already put forth a 3-stage model of female development, and you could think about that as a continuing model of complex integration. And so the reason that sex becomes regulated isn't because it's now being inhibited. It's being regulated because it's being integrated into higher order games. And so it's being integrated, for example, and maybe can even be celebrated within this confined area of, or regulated area of integration. It's becoming integrated with the more mature realization that sex outside of an iterated relationship is actually a net negative, even for the parties involved, even if they're primarily motivated by their own hedonism and then hypothetically their own will. And so it isn't inhibition that's regulating sex, and it isn't top-down social control. It's the necessity of integrating sex, which can be just a unidimensional desire, into a much more sophisticated symphony of social interactions. Now, when that fails, inhibition is necessary, right? So if you have someone who's acting in an antisocial manner, parading their sexuality, insisting upon short-term gratification at their own expense and that of others, then compulsion might have to be brought to bear. But that indicates a failure of the proper developmental pathway rather than a manifestation of a necessarily oppressive patriarchy. And that's a much more positive vision of the regulation of sexual behavior. It's more like ordered freedom rather than inhibition. And that also opens up another positive idea, which is that we've toyed with the idea that the birth control pill meant that impulsive hedonism could now rule, and that would be the highest form of sexual expression. And the idiot artists who jumped on that bandwagon were certainly of that mind. But what we're seeing instead is that young men and women are turning in ever greater numbers to a very casual pornography, especially with regards to the boys, to the abandonment of any relationships whatsoever. And then, interestingly enough, it seems, to much less sexual activity in general. I think it's 30% of Japanese young people under 30 are still virgins, 30%, and similar figures in South Korea. And you can see the same proclivity emerging in the West. So what's happening paradoxically is that by removing all the principles from sexual interaction, not the inhibitions, but the principles, we're actually dooming the sexual enterprise rather than facilitating it, even for the hedonists. So anyways, it's very useful to know that there's an integration model rather than an inhibition model, right? Because it also stops those who might oppose the sexual revolution from just being finger-wagging conservative moralists. Because you can say, no, you're going to have a way better sex life in every possible way if you actually fall in love with someone and have a long-term relationship. And I think the statistical data on that are pretty clear too. Most single people don't have a lot of sex. I think the rule is something like unearned surfeit turns into revulsion. It's too much of a good thing means that it's no longer a good thing. And that goes along with an idea too that there's something like optimal deprivation, right? Look, let's say you've just had a big banquet and someone sits you down and says, now you have to eat 5 pounds of dessert. It's first of all, that's not going to be a very attractive proposition. And second of all, it might actually make you ill, is that everything has to be in proper proportion. And one of the things we really haven't contended with at all in our society is how much desperation is necessary on the sexual front to drive young men and young women together. And the answer is not zero. And the problem with pornography, one of many problems, is that it drives desperation on the male front down to zero. Now, I know perfectly well from my clinical experience that the standard state of most young men, especially under 20, let's say, is pretty much terror in the face of a woman who they're very attracted to. And the reason for that is that, well, there's all sorts of reasons, but the primary reason is the probability that any given male, even one who's very attractive, let's say in multiple ways, is going to be rejected by any given female, especially a high-value female who has a lot of people attracted to her, is extremely high. So there are classic psychological experiments showing this. If you send attractive undergraduates out to talk to other undergraduates to offer sexual access, say, would you be willing to have coffee with me? Would you be willing to give me your phone number? Would you be willing to come back to my apartment? If the girls offer that, then whoever they're offering that to on the male front will take them up on their offer. But if the boys offer that, even when they're attractive, the probability that their advances will be rejected is extremely high. And so young men face the uncomfortable situation where even if they're competent and will turn eventually into useful men, which isn't the status of most very young men, the probability that they'll be rejected is extremely high.